All right, well, welcome everyone to our April 2023 episode of the Midwest Big Data Innovation Hub Data Science Student Groups webinar series. This series is sponsored by the MBDH along with support from the National Science Foundation. I'm John MacMullen, the Executive Director of the Midwest Big Data Innovation Hub. I'm joined on the call today by JD Graham, our outreach specialist. And today we're excited to have a team from the Most Policy Initiative here to talk with us about the work that they do around science and technology policy in Missouri. But first, I'll go ahead and give you all a quick introduction to the Hub and this series. So we are part of a national network of 4 hubs focused on building collaborations and communities across the Midwest and across the nation, focused on data science and other data-related topics, but that is very broadly construed. And so we have a lot of very interesting communities and constituencies within each of the 4 regions that are focused on the regional strengths and opportunities across the U.S. We have been around for several years at this point with support from NSF and from other partners. Here in the Midwest, we are based out of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. But we have university partners across the 12-state region that we serve, and in a lot of those cases, they are leading our thematic priority areas that are focused on particular disciplines. And we can talk a little bit more about that later today. But as I said, in general, we're focused on building different kinds of communities around data. And in our case, we also have a strong focus on students and engaging student groups across the region as well. And so this series is a recurring one that is really focused on helping to build that cross-institution community amongst different student group leaders and students who are interested in data science opportunities. So if folks who are watching this at some point in the future are interested in having your student group present on this series and tell us the kinds of work that you do, we'd be happy to have you join us. And so here's some contact information for you to reach out to us for that. We also do have a Slack community where we can engage offline as well, and an archive of this series of events. So, you know, we really on this webinar turn that community building lens that we do onto students and try to build that community and have folks understand what are some of the ways that student groups at different universities are successful, what kinds of activities do they engage in, and also looking at different kinds of career paths for students as they get through their undergrad and grad work. Where do you go with a data career after graduation? And so we're very happy today to have a different path to look at with science policy. We also have a new partnership with the National Student Data Corps, which is a project led by our partners at the Northeast Big Data Innovation Hub. They have put together a really interesting set of activities and chapters and different groups across the country and even internationally now. And so we are co-leading the Midwest chapter of the NSDC, and you'll see more activities through that series going forward. All right, so today, as I said, we're very happy to have a team from the Most Policy Initiative with us to talk about their work in science policy, working in part with the Missouri legislature. And so our guests are Brittany Whitley, the Executive Director of MOST, and 3 fellows from the MOST Fellowship Program. So welcome, Sarah, Tomy, and Ramon. We're really happy to have you all here today. We spoke with Tomy and Ramon last year with our science communication intern group, but we wanted to sort of open things up more publicly to our larger student audience this year and hear more about the work that you all do and what some of the careers are that students might be able to explore through the kind of work that you do. So I think here I'll turn it over to Brittany to introduce the fellows in more detail and give us a little overview of what MOST does and how it came about.
Awesome. Thank you, John. So like John mentioned, my name is Brittany Whitley. I'm the Executive Director at MOST Policy Initiative. I actually joined MOST in September of 2020 as our first Education and Workforce Development Fellow. So I've been a part of MOST since we've started really doing this work with a full research team. So MOST Policy Initiative, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit group whose goal is to connect science to policymaking. And we do this in a few different ways, but really, like John kind of mentioned, we work directly with Missouri lawmakers to respond to requests for research information that they have. So usually how this will work is a lawmaker is thinking about a bill that they want to write or sponsor, or they have a bill already that's really important to them. And they'll come to us and say, hey, can you pull together some research about this topic? Or my constituent called me and they're really worried about X type of pollution in this community. Can you look into what the health impacts of that is? And so what our team then does is goes into the academic and kind of industry and community reports and tries to find whatever information we can, and then digest all of that and interpret it in a way so that lawmakers can understand what's the scope of this problem, what are the trade-offs that we need to be thinking about. You know, maybe there's health, negative health consequences, but positive economic or environmental benefits. And so you really have to think about kind of priorities and different effects. And we don't make any policy recommendations. So we let lawmakers kind of decide what they value, what their constituents value, but really kind of operate in this place where we think that we'll make better decisions if everybody's kind of operating with that same basic set of information. So this kind of underlying principle of using science and research to make evidence-based decisions, I think, is a really common thread linking our two organizations and why we kind of find ourselves connecting at places like this, you know, in the past and hopefully moving forward too. I will also say really fast before I turn this over to our fellows that MOST Policy Initiative was founded by 3 graduate students at the University of Missouri. So not only are we a pretty new, unique organization that's kind of demonstrating this desire for our work in the Capitol that the fellows can tell you about, but we were born of the idea of a few PhD students who saw some similar efforts in other states and said, wouldn't it be great if our lawmakers in Missouri had access to similar resources? We have some nonpartisan research staff at the Capitol right now, but they're a pretty small office and can't usually answer the types of questions at the speed that legislators always want them to. They're also drafting bills and amendments in real time. So we're kind of trying to fill that gap there. I think the fellows, as they talk to you about their previous experiences and their current experiences with MOST, will talk a lot about kind of the science communication elements, the relationship building elements of this work. But it all really comes down to those core values of accessibility and transparency of information, making sure that our lawmakers and the constituents that they serve can access this information so that we can make decisions. And that we're also clear about when we don't have scientific information to help. Sometimes people want to know what research exists, and there was one study in one place with one very small sample size, and you can't really expand that and say, well, if we did that policy in Missouri, we would definitely have the same impact. So we also try to help people work through some of the ambiguities and challenges in science. So with that, I want to turn it over to our fellows. So I think we'll start with Sarah, and then Sarah, you can popcorn it over to Ramon, and then we'll finish with Tomy. And each of them will tell you a little bit about kind of what they did before they got to MOST, what they work on here. And then we really wanted to kind of center this on the questions from the audience. And so they'll wrap up and take questions. So with that, let me turn it over to Sarah.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Anderson. I got my PhD from Texas Tech University in pharmaceutical science. I am the Human Services and Public Safety Fellow at MOST. And that basically means that if it's people oriented, it comes to me. So I'm looking at children, families, the public safety sphere and all that entails, veterans, disabilities, and my portfolio has a lot of overlap with Ramon's portfolio, as he is the Health and Mental Health Fellow, and those two things really just go hand in hand. And I will I can't remember if Tomy or Ramon was supposed to go next, but whoever's supposed to go next, please unmute yourself.
I can go next. So my name is Ramon Martinez. I got my PhD in pharmaceutical sciences from the University of Maryland in Baltimore. I currently cover the health and mental health portfolio, which of the three of us might in theory be the most kind of discrete and defined portfolio, if you will, but it's not. It can be very broad in its scope of practice, including talking about how hospitals, distribute healthcare, if you will, how licensing and scope of practice law works, how different diseases have different biomedical therapeutic treatments, and also having to digest that information for lawmakers. And also thinking about sort of like always tying, I think one of the things that both me and Sarah in particular have a lot of room to do is to always tie in how there might be a population discrepancy of something in particular. Since we do things that are very people focused, if you will, tie in how, a particular law in practice doesn't necessarily benefit, a huge swath of people. And so looking at that discrete kind of information is sometimes probably the most difficult thing for our program, and finding information that is not only informative but nuanced. I'll cut it short there. We can circle to Tomy and then perhaps circle back about our experiences leading up to our fellowship program.
Yeah. So did you want to wait until later to talk about how we got to this position, or should we go ahead and talk about it now? I don't know if you had plans, John or somebody.
I like Ramon's idea of
Okay.
let's do that next and see, how you got to where you are now. What was the road that led you here? So yeah, if we can just start with Tomy with your
right.
current role and what you do at most, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief then. So before I started at Most, I got my PhD at Penn State in physics. I am currently the Energy and the Environment Policy Fellow here at Most Policy Initiative. I have also sort of have the probably most loosely defined portfolio. I've taken on a lot of the other topics that legislators have come up to us with. So I've done written science notes on initiative petition, agriculture, how seaweed affects methane emission from cows, sports betting, broadband infrastructure, and then also stuff that you would think falls into energy and the environment, such as nuclear energy, solar energy, things like that.
Very good. So maybe we go back to Sarah at this point, and you talked about your PhD work and how that connects to your current role around health. But how did you get to that point? What were you thinking as a undergrad and things, particularly around career, that led you to this point?
So when I was an undergrad, I got my undergrad in pharmaceutical science, and I was just looking at the jobs available to me, and I was like, wow, I'm really not interested in any of these jobs. Let's continue on, because all the jobs that I am interested in, I need a PhD for. And as I was doing my PhD, PhDs are very time and labor intensive, and they teach you a lot about yourself. And I learned that I love learning about science. I love talking about science. I do not like doing science. And so I found that science communication was an area that I was really interested in. And science policy is like this really expanding field within science communication, outside of like, when I initially thought about science communication, I thought, oh, I could become a teacher, or I could become a journalist, I guess. But then the internet was like, hey, have you considered science policy? And I was like, I haven't considered science policy, but I'm very interested. And I was particularly really interested in most because I just love how this program does its work. Basically, it's very nonpartisan. We're not pushing information. We're not supporting specific legislators, excuse me. And that really appealed to me on like a intellectual level of like, if I was to get involved in politics, which I never was super interested in politics. I was very interested in political issues, but not politics, if that makes sense. And I was like, if I'm gonna go into this field, this is basically the only way that I would want to do so. And then I applied and I was like, hey, what do you think of me? And they're like, we'll give you a shot. So that is how I got to most. It was basically just me being like, what are fields outside of a lab? How can I take what I like about science and make this a job?
Absolutely. We have heard that from a lot of students who really love science, but they don't necessarily want to work in a lab in their career. So how about you, Ramon? What was your thinking around that?
So part of this will be a little bit of my grievances about the U.S. educational system, in that they always ask you from the age of 5 or 6, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I always would say, I don't know, but I like science, in the same sort of manner as Sarah. I would personally like to think that in the future, we get into a system where we can start to say, this is what I don't like. Because that is essentially what my career decision-making process has been from the very get-go. It's been a steady refinement of checking off things and Xing things and saying, I actually don't like doing that, but it was a nice shot. So when I was in undergraduate, I did my bachelor's in biochemistry at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And I participated in a program that tried to immerse disadvantaged students directly in the lab, get them in there, get them going, and learn how the science process works. During that program, I learned a couple of things. Lab work wasn't necessarily the thing that I found was most, let's say, rewarding, in the sense that lab and data and experiments are slow, and rewards take a long time to reap the benefit of. But I learned early on that regardless of what I wanted to do in the field of science, that getting my PhD would have been important, especially in the field of biology, since getting kind of basic science background in biochemistry and biology, perhaps chemistry, can be good, but going to graduate school can be even better. And that was the main token that I took from that program. When I went to look for PhD programs, I looked for programs that had a little bit more of that sort of translational and community aspect of it, which is why, I don't know if Sarah can attest to the same reason, but I got a degree in pharmaceutical science, partially because the science was actually on the cutting edge of, could it be something that works in the clinic? When I did my PhD, researched cancer therapeutics and the potential that they could be used in the clinic for melanoma treatments. And I think I joked with Tomy about this some time ago, how I also did graduate school at a time that was really interesting, because I saw 3 different presidential administrations go through from start to finish. And kind of the way that government utilized information across those 3 administrations made me realize that, like, it is really important for scientists to be able to tell a story towards decision makers in a timely manner. And so part of my graduate work involved looking at say how treatments could be used in the clinical and patient level. And because of that, on the side, I also did a little bit of community engagement and advocacy work with some school program, with some student organizations. I also participated in student government, and I would say that is a really, really, really crucially important tool that I thought was helpful for me in the process of getting into the work of policy and talking with decision makers, because a lot of those interpersonal skills are not something that necessarily just bloom just by sitting in the lab and working every day. So right around third or fourth year of graduate school is when I realized I think that this burgeoning field of science policy is something that I want to go into, especially after learning about a fellowship program that the National American Association for the Advancements of Science sponsors, their Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program. But at the same token, right as I was getting out of grad school, the timing worked out that the MOST policy program also had their application out right when I was thinking of leaving. So applied, got in, and I'm here now. It's been really fun and really informative. And if Tomy and me can admit, helped us with our next step, which is going to the AAAS program for our second round interviews. So segue to Tomy, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, so actually when I was an undergrad, I didn't even know what that science policy was really like a career option for scientists. And it wasn't until I was in grad school when I was starting to think about what I want to do afterwards that I really started exploring different options, including science policy. I think I knew pretty early along in my grad program that I wasn't interested in staying in academia. For me, it just wasn't personally that fulfilling. You know, research can be very slow and you're never sure what type of impact your research could have on society as a whole. So for me, I wanted something where I could a little bit more easily understand how I was affecting society. I actually sort of dabbled in data science a little bit. I taught myself some data science and machine learning and participated in a Kaggle competition. But I also explored science policy. I was fortunate enough to have a science policy club at my university at Penn State. So I joined that, started attending their meetings, and learned about the National Science Policy Network, which is a sort of national organization that anybody can join. I think there might be a $10 annual membership fee, but there are lots of opportunities to engage through NSPN that are very helpful for anybody who's interested. And I think the $10 a year or whatever it is definitely worth it. Through NSPN, I found out that there was a group in Pennsylvania who's actually trying to start their own science policy fellowship, similar to what I'm in currently at MOST, for the state of Pennsylvania, though. One thing that maybe I'll say right now is that their state level science policy fellowships are still relatively rare. There's maybe a dozen or so in the United States. And so in the Midwest, I think Missouri maybe is the only well-established program. I do know there are attempts to create programs in Illinois and Wisconsin, and Ohio had a pilot. But in terms of well-established, I think Missouri is the only one. And then this is all to say that, you know, there's plenty of space, and a lot of these states fellowship programs are established by graduate students and early career scientists. So if you're sort of an entrepreneurial mindset, you know, that could potentially be an option for you. Create your own job, you know, become the executive director of your own science policy fellowship for your own state. But it is time consuming, and, you know, there might not be a lot of pay. It'll be a lot of volunteer work up front. And in any case, I'm doing that on the side. And yeah, so from sort of joining the science policy club at my university, getting involved in other programs through NSPN, I started to figure out that I really do enjoy science policy and applied to MOST.
Great, thank you. So very interesting trajectories for all of you in your careers. I see a lot of similarities, but also some interesting differences too. And I think I have a lot of follow-up questions for you, but I think one in particular. So Ramon, you mentioned the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. That is a longstanding program that really is trying to bring in scientists and folks with domain experience into policy. But I think a lot of people may think of science policy as being more legal focused. Maybe you have to have a law degree to be in science policy, particularly if you're working with the legislature, for example. So, I'm wondering, Brittany, feel free to chime in on this as well, but, is there a role for legal expertise in some of the work that you do? Are you having to look at other legislation that has been passed in other states, or looking at other sort of legal issues versus science issues when you're doing the work that you do?
I can chime in here. So the one almost consistent aspect of the work that we do is we always want to see what we can do comparative legal a sort of outlook for the legislators. I think that part of the understanding of has something been proven data-wise, if it worked in somewhere else, is if someone else has done it first. There's a lot of legalese in our job that we look at from time to time that we don't necessarily understand, nor when a policy is enacted, it may have just been started and there's no background data behind it to support it. All of those things are what legislators are interested in. They want to know if surrounding states have made the same policy decision. They want to know if there's data to support that, or if they just started this policy decision. And while we're not legal experts, I think that we always welcome help from people who do have more legal expertise. Just keep in mind that policymakers, the vast majority of them also start off with no legal background. And so they are also passing policy and learning in the process of making policy. And so I think part of the job and the benefit of having our PhD is that we've been able to kind of learn pretty quickly on the job the same things that the legislators are learning.
The way that we always like to tell this to people when we're training them is like the reason why we hire scientists to do science policy is because of the critical thinking skills that you have to have as a scientist to work through problems, the way that you troubleshoot things, the way that you evaluate other information when you're a scientist and you're saying, do I trust that person's code, or do I trust that person's analysis and conclusion they came to? And so legal expertise is great, but it's also super okay and encouraged to just figure out where to get the legal expertise if you need it. So our fellows will call, folks in other states or the nonpartisan research office who's drafting the bills. I think, but that being said, reading bills is complicated and something that when we're orienting our new fellows, we spend a little bit of time kind of talking through, hey, there's 6 pages of this bill and it's in language that's very different than both science communication best practices and academic science best practices. So it's certainly a skill set, but I think you don't have to be able to do it on your own. If you can figure out how to get access to that expertise through existing resources, we have specific skills, I think, that we can kind of focus on.
Guys, John mentioned your varied yet similar backgrounds. When you think about, hindsight's always 20/20, and everybody here has a PhD, but maybe somebody who's thinking about going into science policy doesn't need to get a PhD, or maybe you think that would be helpful. If you were guiding someone today, said, I like what you do, I want to do something similar, what kind of field of study, what do you think you wish you had taken? Or does it just serendipity that yeah, it just works because it works? What kind of advice would you give them?
I'll pop on for this one. And I'm gonna pop on just because pharmaceutical science and the topics I cover don't link over super nicely, but I think we can say that for all of PhDs. My thesis was inflammatory bowel disease and adult stem cells. So, and I have not touched either of those topics since my thesis. But when you're doing a PhD, you kind of know that you might go into a field where you're never going to touch your thesis topic again. It's more about the skills that you've developed rather than being a, great repository of knowledge about inflammatory bowel disease. And so I think as long as you're able to develop the skills of communicating to a non-scientific audience, being able to do literature reviews, which is basically you just read so much information and then consolidate it. Those are the skills that you develop as a PhD, but I wouldn't say that those are skills that you can only develop as a PhD. Like if there are master's programs where you're developing those same skills, then that's great. And that's what we need in science policy. There's nothing magical about my PhD. It just taught me the skills that I needed to do this job. So.
Yeah, definitely. Brittany, you bring up a good point as well in the chat, saying maybe leadership skills and community outreach, or maybe even things you don't take in a classroom, might be one of those linchpin activities that really help with something like science policy.
I was trying so hard to not talk, but I feel really strongly about this. I think like you can sit in a room and model the impact of urban heat in a certain region, but if you don't include people in the conversation who have worked with people who have experienced urban heat, who have talked to them about the barriers about like getting healthcare or respite from that, then I don't think the work's super effective. Then you just have a bunch of numbers that don't necessarily match up to the needs. And so what I put in the chat was just my 2 cents that we set this up as a PhD program because that's how a lot of the other states do it. And there is an inherent expertise that comes with your PhD. But that being said, I really see the future of science policy being broad and not exclusive to like traditional scientists that would have been professors if they would have just stayed in academia. I think we need a lot more types of expertise than that.
I'll also say, as perhaps the only person whose degree is even the closest to my portfolio space, I think the only times that I've utilized knowledge that I directly took from my PhD was just how FDA regulations work. And that's only come up maybe like 2 or 3 times in the entire almost 2 years that I've been here. And so it's very much one of those things where it's like, you can definitely learn a lot of new topics in a short amount of space, and you don't necessarily need this advanced degree to do it. Most of the individuals that we talk with in the legislative house and agency expertise and even some lobbyists, a lot of those folks are at most maybe having a master's. And I've heard masters of public policy or masters of public health often in my sphere. So those are also degrees that I think are highly underrated, but should be looked at more for people who want to get into this space. And it's that's just another one of my qualms with the education system, if you will.
Well, that's good to hear for one of the students who we have on the call today, Aisha, who's one of our science communication interns, who is a recent MPH graduate. So good news, Aisha. So one of the things that I heard from you earlier, Ramon, was around storytelling and how important that is. And you all are obviously trying to produce things that are factually accurate and informative, but it seems like you may need to do that sometimes in a more compelling way than, writing a journal article for a scientific publication. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about storytelling and how you all approach that, not necessarily a conflict, but that tension maybe between factual accuracy and storytelling and being compelling in the work that you do.
I think one thing that I will say is that because we are strictly nonpartisan and we do not try to, tell legislators to vote this way or that way, we are not that interested in perhaps persuasive writing. So I think we don't use stories that often in that specific regard. Oftentimes, there may be limited amounts of information, and in which case you have to rely on sort of case studies to say this has happened like this in this location in this specific scenario. It may or may not apply to Missouri, but this is at least one example of this specific policy application. Does anybody else have anything else they want to say?
Yeah, I'll pop in with our peer review process here. So part of what we do for our science notes is one person works on them and then sends it off to the other fellows for editing. And part of the editing process is sometimes just being like, hey, we're going to move this section from the bottom to the top because it makes more sense here. You have we're keeping topics together, or you brought this up at the end of the paragraph and you need to bring it up in the next paragraph, or like something that feedback that I got on more than one of my science notes was like, you have all the information here, just not necessarily in an order that makes a lot of sense. And I think that can tie into the storytelling aspect of like, if all your information is there, but like, why is it organized in this manner? Then like, that's not super helpful to the readers.
Yeah, and so I have an example of that that I'll put in the chat here. So here's a science note by Tomy. It's about municipal solid waste, not a topic that a lot of people are super excited about, even though they probably should be. And so, you're not necessarily going to do some storytelling around this that is going to get them really excited about the topic. But I think the way that this is structured provides really easy ways to understand the impact here that, is easier to understand than a journal article. So you have a paragraph about what the research highlights are at the very top, and then you have some claims that you're providing and giving some evidence for. So municipal solid waste landfills produce pollutants that are potentially harmful to humans. Pretty easy to understand that scientific claim. It ties into human health, right? And there's other local community kinds of impacts there. And so, underneath that, you've got evidence to support that claim, basically. Is that a structure that is pretty common for the way that you guys develop these notes and present information?
Yeah, it's super intentional. This is actually something our entire team spent a lot of time this past summer figuring out, was changing how we presented information to make it easier to be skimmable and logical and picking out those main points in the notes. And that I want to point out what Sarah had said, the last piece, that was really a major form of evolution in my thinking. I used to say we can't do storytelling as a nonpartisan group because I can't tell you the anecdote of the person who got cancer sitting next to the landfill, because now I'm saying landfills are bad and we don't do that. And what I think was really kind of transformative for the way that I think about it is exactly what you were saying, John, is that you can still set up a flow, right? What is the problem first? Set up the problem so people know why they have to why they should care about this. Then set up kind of what the status quo is, and then then introduce how you might want to change it rather than just leading with the end at the beginning. And so I think that kind of flow to it. I'm happy to see that you found the story in it, because we really tried to do that. And that, like Sarah said, is the result of everybody on this team reading everybody else's notes and giving feedback at multiple stages, so that what you see is the best of all of our brains. And it sounds like at least on this one it worked. So I love to hear that.
Something else that I'll point out is a change that happened between Ramon and Tomy's cohort and me coming in is the science notes went from multi-page notes to just 2. And that was because the fellows were like, we don't think everybody's reading the full note. And when we give them a 1-page document that's front and back, we're like, listen, this is very digestible. This is very easy to read. This is not a 6-page report. Like, and that that makes information more accessible to people, which is a part of good storytelling, I think.
I think this is also part of the trial and error process of how different state policy fellowships that may or may not be developed into the future can't do a one-size-fits-all approach either. If you try to model some of our policy work a la what they do in the federal government, well, the important thing about Missouri law is that we have term limits, which means there's not a lot of institutional knowledge of legislators about particular topics because they haven't been spending decades and decades on the same committees doing the same work the way that your senator from your state may have been. You know, they're not career politicians to any degree. They're limited to 8 years in either chamber. And so part of our job is to talk also just about the historical and environmental aspect of the law or policy that you're considering. You know, don't just consider the fact that this has to, you know, apply to Missouri state law, but also remember that federal law is tied to any time that I have to write on Medicaid or Medicare or, you know, Sarah recently did something on federal gun legislation. And it's like, all of these things have to meld together. And that's part of how we inform and educate as much as think about policy.
On a personal level, I was wondering also, I'm sure there is a lot of personal satisfaction from seeing your material used, but I can imagine the other side of the coin is frustration when either it's not used or maybe you feel like it's being incorrectly used. What's the process that you go about? Is it just something you take home? Is it something you address? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think once like we publish it and it's public out there, we sort of let legislators do whatever they want with it. And yes, there can be, you know, some sour feelings if it's not used in a way that you would have liked it to use. I think that is relatively rare though. More often, you might just not hear from a legislator and it's maybe you're not certain if they're using the information at all. But more, I have seen legislators use my information more often than not, and in ways I think accurately represent the information. So I don't think it has been that much of a concern, or at least it hasn't impacted me negatively.
I think for me, I just kind of got to like count the wins where I can. Like I recently wrote a note, I gave it to the legislator, and then like I didn't hear back, and I was like, all right. I worked really hard on that, but all right. And then another time I wrote a note and then I heard back from the legislator and they were like, I love this. I love most. Like, give me all your information. And I was just like, yes, yes. Like, this is great. Like, and it's just kind of part of the job of like, sometimes you get like really great feedback and people are just like applauding you as you walk by and you're like, and then other times it's like, okay, on to the next topic, I guess.
I would also say part of the benefit of our program too is since it's public, there's been several times where we'll talk with a legislator And we had no contact with them, but they are friends with the other legislator who was the one that we gave the report to. They shared the note with them and they mentioned that information. So one of the things that's interesting is that we're still trying to work on metrics about how we can capture when other people who we had no contact with also shared our information. There's been a couple times where I think, especially Brittany, you can correct me, if we were listening to some floor debates and a topic that I know I wrote was mentioned out of some legislator's mouth. Another legislator from the other side of the aisle also says, but also X, Y, and Z, which I also know was from the same note. And so sometimes it's nice to just see what happens after you put a piece of information and people will frame it to their narrative, if you will.
Yeah, I think that last point Ramon made super important, that accessibility piece, because these briefs, like just about anything else that you publish, academic papers, blog posts, whatever, people can cherry pick what they want to find. If we're talking about trade-offs and you really want this bill to pass, you might pick the numbers that most support your thing and maybe choose to ignore or downplay what doesn't support your position. But the idea is that over time, as more people realize these resources exist and have access to them, you can have more situations like Ramon said, where somebody comes back and says, okay, but well, what about this? And then what you're having is a conversation that says, we acknowledge that A and B are the case, and now we have to decide if A is more important than B. And that becomes a values debate where you now say, we understand what the outcomes will be, we have to decide what we're more comfortable with. And so I think that's certainly the ideal that we want. It's harder because sometimes the information we're citing other groups, so we don't know if they got it directly from us or from them. So it's not super direct, but I think the fellows have all heard individually and at committee hearings, members say that they really valued the work. And so like Sarah said, I try to hang on to those too, because I think that's exciting and you don't see that a lot, people taking time away to say, hey, these guys really helped out and we appreciate them.
We also have internally a record of who asks for information, and I like to think of people as our frequent flyers, of just people who are we want information from you on everything. And whenever that happens, you're like, okay, cool, they have our products and they really like it, and we are doing a good job here.
Yeah.
And that doesn't go for it's across the spectrum, political parties, topics, everything. Just people find us useful and we can see that, and it's really good.
Yeah, I mean, at least you know that they're engaging with the work that you do and it's driving the conversation to some extent. I think there is a perception that in a lot of cases, legislators already have their minds made up and they're not really open to evidence. And there's also, I think, a sense that, industry lobbying drives legislation to some extent as well. And they bring their own data, which may not be public. And there's model legislation that comes from partisan political groups as well that, gets them 90% of the way there in some cases without a lot of input. And so, just knowing that people are looking at what you're developing, I think would be a win for sure.
I think one of our most impactful metrics that we've gotten so far in the last couple of years is that we've written over 200 individual legislative research notes, and the breakdown of those requests are about 70-30, and that's roughly proportionally what the political breakdown of the Missouri legislature is. Mm-hmm. So we're not seeing one party overuse us, one or the other. So it's really nice.
Interesting. All right, we are getting close to the end of our time here, so I wanted to sort of shift in conclusion to what you all would say to students who are considering policy as a career. I want to come back to something that Tomy said about your science policy club at Penn State. When you're in that environment and you have students who are interested in what this is. How did you approach them? What was your sort of outreach method to make science policy interesting and get that on their radar?
In terms of how did I approach the club, or how did the club approach other interested people?
Yeah, so since this group, this webinar is often working with student clubs, one of the things that we talk about is how you can be effective as a student club leadership to get your message out. There's so many different clubs on campuses. So how do you get your message to stand out a little bit and get people excited about what you did? So, at the Penn State case, what was your approach to some of that?
Yeah, I mean, you can host several events. I think something fairly common, not necessarily just to science policy clubs, is like Capitol Hill Days. That's fairly common. I think lots of people are interested in going to the federal capital, but also you could do something similar for your local state capital as well. I think that's a great chance, and there's a good probability you'll get face-to-face time with your legislator as well. I think people are fairly drawn to that opportunity. Science on Tap type events are very popular. We held those with the Science Policy Club at Penn State. Essentially, you bring local scientists and get them to talk in a casual environment to non-scientists. That's just a good way to get the general public interested in science in general. Yeah. I mean, I think I know the Science Policy Society recently hosted their first science policy symposium. So they invited some speakers to Penn State and had an entire day-long event, I believe. So there's various types of events I think people are interested in and you can use to sort of build interest in science policy.
Great. So Sarah, Ramon, what else would you say to students who are starting to get interested in policy and want to explore that?
I think probably the most important thing is just being proactive about whatever you're interested in. So if it's very important to learn about these topics and to be an informed citizen, but if you want to get involved, you got to jump in feet first, start writing, get involved with groups. If there isn't a group, start a group. Being passive makes you informed, but it doesn't get you involved in the nitty-gritty. So if there isn't an opportunity, try to make one for yourself.
I would also say, try your best to teach yourself about how the legislative process works, particularly either at the local or state level. I think that the governments nowadays do a really good job of making things as transparent as humanly possible, and as good as live streaming things on the computer. Learn about how your particular state passes bills, and learn about how the process for input from the general public is involved, because only then will you then learn from an early stage how you can get involved, knowing what structures are there that you have to maneuver around.
Would you guys say it's fair to say as well that maybe not to be so stressed out, that it's okay not to know exactly what you want to do, as long as what you do with rigor and passion, because it'll all kind of unfold. I mean, it looks like this unfolded for you, and if somebody wants this, there are some more clear ways to get here, but there are a lot of other unclear, uncharted paths that maybe people get a little stressed out. Like you said, you had to know when you were in third grade, what do you want to do? And it's okay not to know what you want to do.
I always like to tell people, when I was a sophomore in college, I told my family I finished all my science credits, so I never have to take another science class again because I hate science. And now I'm running a science policy nonprofit. In between, I was going to be a doctor and I was going to be a research professor, and then I was going to work at a science center. So I'm relatively young for the science world. And I was really, really excited about all of those. And there might be something, you know, new in the future or some combination of ways to do it. But I like how Ramon had kind of described it as like, try a bunch of things and then keep track of what you like and what you don't like. Go talk to a legislator. And if you hate it, then make a note of that and say, you know what, that isn't something that I think I can make myself want to like and find joy in, and that's okay. Yes, very much so. I am not where I expected I would be, but I'm super happy that I'm here.
That's
Yeah, I
great.
think a lot of our students would, people watching this will take solace in that it's really easy to see where you are or any of us are and think we all got here by design and plan. And if they don't have a plan, that they're lacking. Not that a plan is bad, but it's not the only part that gets you to where you'll be at a happy place.
Yeah, I think Ramon's point of just exploring your options and being okay with the fact that, like, you know, you're not going to like everything, or you're not going to be well suited for everything. Like, that's okay. You're not meant to be well liked and well suited for absolutely everything in this world. And you'll find your niche and you'll find what you really enjoy.
I think that's spoken like a true scientist already, though.
Very good. Well, I want to be mindful of your time. We're at the top of the hour here. It has been fantastic to talk with you all. I know that our students will really enjoy hearing your thoughts today. So thank you for taking the time. We look forward to talking with you all in the future. We'd be happy to talk about ways that the two organizations could work together on future activities. So we'll be in touch, but really appreciate you being here today and talking with us.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for having us. Have a good
Thank you.
weekend.
You have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.